Please be advised that this serving of AIDS, the Lost Voices, may cause offense or upset as
we read newspaper articles from the 1980s and 90s that may include language and phrases that may be viewed outdated. Some articles and discussions may include brief references and descriptions to self-harm, death, post-mortem, and the odd uncontrollable expletive not suitable for children or adults that act like children. Roll it!
AIDS brings a response from the government.
AIDS, the disease which claimed life.
Welcome to Extra Tea with your camp host, William Hampson.
And my fabulous co-host, Gloria.
And between us, we'll be looking back through the decades at how Britain reported on the AIDS pandemic.
And where we will try to unpick individual stories in the newspaper archives from the 80s, 90s, and noughties.
Ready?
Ready.
All right, let's do it. Oi, oi, governor.
Is that meant to be me?
All right, geezer. Off pound of apples, me old chum.
Oh, even I can't do a Cockney accent. All right, mate. All right, geezer. Oh, I'm just apple me. You know,
Okay, before this descends into total chaos, shall we get on with the show? So last week we delved into the British newspaper archives and how they covered the AIDS pandemic. While the odd article is slightly humorous today, much of the language and reporting was utterly, well, jaw-dropping. How they got away with it is beyond me.
I'd often be the first person to say, actually, that sometimes the past is best left in the past. But I think when we memorialise, commemorate and remember darker periods of our history, and quite rightly so, I find it a little bit bizarre that it's still considered to be a little bit taboo because it makes people uncomfortable to remember and commemorate the AIDS pandemic. When I came across story after story where an individual's HIV/AIDS status was the headline, dominated the story, which, as we uncovered in the previous serving, take away HIV/AIDS, there's no story to be had at all, then I think if this makes you feel uncomfortable, then I think you've still got some work to do in regards to your perception of HIV and AIDS and perhaps some stigma that you still hold. And if on reflection these stories perhaps bring down your mood, make you feel a little bit sad, then it allows you to at least just take one step in the shoes of these individuals that have had no say in being outed as having HIV/AIDS, the gay plague, the dreaded gay plague, often being outed as gay by these national newspapers. You know, they're having to deal with the diagnosis and then top of it, the stigma and the vilification by the national press.
Yes, take away the mention of HIV or AIDS, and there is no story, I agree.
But had it severely impacted heterosexual people, perhaps governments would have been faster to react. You know, everybody would have rallied round, people would have been clapping for doctors and nurses, people would have been having cake sales and fundraisers and doing everything that they could. There would have been a proper keep calm and carry on mentality.
And now, of course, in the UK, heterosexual HIV infections have rapidly taken over HIV infections of gay men.
Yeah, and where are the stories in the media? And I'm not for a second saying the media should treat people like they did decades previously, but the fact is a straight man or a straight woman being HIV positive just isn't newsworthy because you can't vilify straight people.
And I think that's why it's important. No matter how hard or upsetting many of these stories are, they shouldn't lay forgotten in newspaper archives.
And for me, many of the stories are the voice of the journalist while silencing the people that they've been so vile about, that they're outing as having HIV/AIDS in the national newspaper, outing as having the gay plague, outing as being gay often in many of them, and with absolutely no context. And in many instances, like we said, take away the HIV/AIDS element and there's no story there whatsoever. I mean, it clearly just shows the kind of British media had a set agenda, which was to vilify people living with HIV and AIDS and vilify the gay community.
Absolutely.
And speaking of which, if you're ready, shall we kick off with the first article?
Okay, let's do it. I have the Kleenex on standby just in case.
Good, but I think you'll be all right. Anyway, so this first article is from the Sunday People and it's from 1986. And while I've said before that I'm not offended by language, even if it is perhaps like still stigmatizing, I must admit in this 2-page spread, in some places, the language blew my mind. And we mentioned this spread in the last serving. It's a 2-page spread by the Sunday People, and it seems to be a bit of a regular feature now. And we've got the Grim Reaper, which is a skull face, a skeletal face with the hood. But this time in the back, we've got what looks like it's been chiseled out of stone. We've got the word AIDS lingering behind him. So as I say, this is the Sunday People, 16th of November 1986, and just above the headline, we've got, I think it's like a strap line that says, "At last, the permissive society is dead, killed off by the plague."
Oh no. It's not a good start, is it?
I mean, when is it ever a good start? So anyway, the headline reads, Girls Who Say No to Sex. And the article kicks off by saying, the horror of catching AIDS has led to top model Maria Whittaker to insist on a no-sex rule with every man she goes out with. Although on the right-hand side is a massive picture of Maria kneeling on a wicker chair with her tits out. I mean, you can't get more 80s than that, can you? And the article continues, and other girls on the studio and catwalk circuit are following her virginal example. I am seriously keeping myself to myself until I fall in love with Mr. Right and feel ready to settle down, says 18-year-old Maria, who displays her youthful charms on the opposite page. I think they're referring to her tits. Oh, man. Anyway, the slightest risk of catching AIDS terrifies me. I want to be courted slowly. Casual sex is right out. The same goes for all my girlfriends. Today is a steady boyfriend or no one at all. At the moment, I'm not interested in anyone, says Maria.
For 1986, it's quite refreshing to hear that a woman is expressing publicly the concern of contracting HIV, and it's not fixated on gay men.
I mean, yeah, if you can take your eyes off her knockers, then yeah, it's a really good message that here we have a heterosexual woman who's, sharing fears of contracting HIV and AIDS through being promiscuous as well. So I think from that aspect, yeah, it is quite refreshing. And also as well, Yvonne Paul, a former model from the 1960s, is, by the time of this article in 1986, running several glamour model agencies. So she's obviously looking after many girls. And as the article continues, Yvonne's actually quoted as saying, when I was a model back in the 60s, the pill allowed real guilt-free sex, she says. The pressure was on to go out with flashy film directors or rich men with Mediterranean yachts. The men expected to bed a girl at the end of the night, just as photographers expected sex with a model after a location shoot.
That's interesting.
I mean, that was interesting, but what really got my attention from this 2-page spread was the article on the right-hand side with the headline that reads, Freddie leads the stars into battle.
Freddie Mercury?
Well, let's find out. The article says, top comedian Freddie Starr and a galaxy of showbiz celebrities have volunteered to put some punch into the government fight against AIDS. Britain's best paid comic is so worried about the spread of the killer disease, he is rounding up an all-star team to raise money for victims and to publicise the dangers of sleeping around. He will discuss the campaign with Social Services Secretary Norman Fowler, which later became Lord Fowler, member of the government's Super Committee on AIDS, which meets again on Tuesday. Freddie, who has invited singer Engelbert Humperdinck and other stars.
Ooh, Engelbert Humperdinck. Quando.
That Engelbert Humperdinck. Right, let's get back to the article. Your singing was lovely, by the way. Perfect. Back to the article. Freddie, who has invited singer, it's probably best if we just call him Mr. Quando, and other stars to back him, says, I will put my superstar committee at the government's disposal. Right, now, brace yourself, because this is the bit that just got me. It's quoted, Freddie Starr is quoted as saying, someone with AIDS is like a walking machine gun, passing a possible death sentence to anyone they sleep with.
No way. He did not say that, surely. Someone with AIDS is like a walking machine gun? Wow, what a dick.
Oh, do you know? And you shouldn't laugh. I mean, it's not funny. It's just a bizarre choice of words. And I know Freddie Starr was a comedian, but it is just, for 1986, it just seems like a very bad choice of words. I mean, even today it's a bad choice of words, but I don't get the impression from the article that he's trying to be a comedian or he's trying to be funny about it. I think these are his genuine beliefs. But you know what I can't work out? What's worse, the fact that he said it or the fact that the fucking newspaper printed it?
Both. It was an absolutely moronic thing to say then and even now. It's beyond me. I don't know.
So this article does continue with the quote from Freddie Starr, where he continues to say, we must encourage people to behave more responsibly and go on a sex diet. Ugh. If you are married, stick to your wife. If you aren't, stick to one partner. Freddie believes everyone should take an AIDS test. He has taken the screening himself and the result was negative. He's quoted as saying, this plague threatens to be the worst ever known to mankind. The support of Freddie, Engelbert and others will give the National AIDS campaign a much-needed boost amid the widespread criticism of doing too little, too late. And inset into the article is a picture of Freddie Starr with his name beside the title of Crusader.
And what did Normal Fowler have to say?
Well, this article concludes, In an exclusive interview with The People, Norman Fowler said, "This is a national battle and I welcome the support of these well-known stars. I will be delighted to set up a meeting."
To have been a fly on the wall at that meeting.
Yeah, I think it's great that well-known stars at the time, like we see in present day, will always come forward to try and raise attention of a cause. Language back then in 1986, was it really helpful, really? Was it not just playing into the stigma and the rhetoric and the sensationalism of it by saying that people with HIV/AIDS are like walking machine guns? Anyway, yeah, to have been a fly on the wall, I wasn't able to find anything that had happened, like any kind of charity event or fundraiser that was reported in the media anyway. But yeah, I'll have to keep looking. Right, so moving on to the next story, staying with the Sunday People, this time on the 4th of March 1984, they published a story by Midrin Jones with the headline, "Gay Killer Puts Docs in Terror."
Well, that's subtle.
And the article says, terrified British doctors are refusing to carry out a post-mortem on a victim of the dreaded sex disease, AIDS.
Again, the sensationalist language. Terrified British doctors? Is this because doctors are trusted within society, that if doctors are terrified, then so should be the public?
Absolutely. And the article goes on to say, the body of 42-year-old Michael Pittman from Wimbledon, South London, was instantly sealed in a coffin to await cremation. Mr. Pittman, who lived alone, became the 38th Briton to be struck down by the untouchable disease. AIDS, which stands for Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, has been dubbed the gay plague because it attacks mainly homosexuals.
What does she mean, attacks mainly homosexuals? So you don't have to be gay to get the gay plague?
Essentially, it appears that that's what she's saying. No, in one breath, the message is, don't worry if you're not homosexual because it's dubbed the gay plague, because it only attacks the gays. And in another breath, she's saying, if you're not a homosexual and you do get it, then you know who to blame.
Oh dear.
But anyhow, the article continues. Although the cause of Mr. Pittman's death was also given as pneumonia, no autopsy was held after he died at St George's Hospital, Tooting. Last year, leading pathologist Dr. Keith Simpson refused an autopsy on a man suspected of having AIDS. And inset is a photograph of this lovely Dr. Keith Simpson that they've just mentioned.
So what's the point of the article? What part of it is newsworthy? A man dies of pneumonia and no autopsy was given?
Yeah, I'm kind of inclined to agree with you. I mean, to me, none of it. And that's not to diminish that Mr. Pittman's passed away. Not at all. But, I mean, you take away the HIV/AIDS element to it, which we get at the end of the article hasn't been confirmed, then there is no story. A man dies of pneumonia. It's as simple as that. I mean, you could argue that there is a public interest, as they claim he is the 38th Briton to die of AIDS, but I'm not sure how they confirmed it was AIDS and not just pneumonia. I mean, I can only assume AIDS presented itself, physically. I mean, they must have had some information to rule it as an AIDS-related pneumonia death. But I think also as well, the other question that we need to ask is why they couldn't retain some dignity for Mr. Pittman by not disclosing his name. Because in doing so, they've outed him as a homosexual, given, she states in the article, quote, dubbed the gay plague because it attacks mainly homosexuals. So whether she's saying it out loud, she's alluding that this gentleman who's passed away from AIDS, which, given that this is dubbed the gay plague, it must be a homosexual. I mean, if she wanted to report that a 38th person had died of AIDS, given this was 1984, then by all means, why not just state something along the lines of, a man from South London, aged 42, is known to be the 38th person in Britain to die of AIDS. A post-mortem was refused, etc. She didn't need to name Michael. But I think it's clear, really, that the article's sole purpose was to strike fear with the public whilst vilifying Michael, whether he was gay or not, because we have no way of knowing, but also vilifying and stigmatising gay men and those that tested positive for HIV and AIDS by basically saying, like you said earlier, the kind of headline is telling the reader that even the doctors are terrified, and these are the medical experts. So if they're terrified, you should be too.
And what's the story behind the pathologist Dr. Simpson refusing to carry out a post-mortem for suspecting the deceased has AIDS a year earlier?
Well, as you can imagine, I've taken a disliking to Dr. Keith Simpson already, and being a nosy bitch, I did look up Dr. Simpson in the archives and found several articles, as he was actually a highly regarded Home Office pathologist. In his obituary of 1985, it states he was a pioneer in his field and, quote, his scientific trail of clues helped to send to the scaffold, so hanging, murderers like Hay, the acid bath killer, Neville Heath, the sadist, and James Hanratty. But it was an article I found in The Observer on the 6th of November 1983 where Dr. Simpson's refusal to carry out a post-mortem came under scrutiny. Now the headline reads, AIDS suspect may have died of heroin dose. A man aged 22, whose death was attributed last week to the killer disease AIDS, may in fact have died after a heroin injection.
So, a heroin overdose.
That I'm not sure, because I assumed a heroin overdose was something that perhaps happened instantly, whereas this article shares that events unfolded over several days. And I should also point out that the 22-year-old man that they're referring to was a young man by the name of Stuart Thompson Neal. So the article continues. Thompson Neal's friend at the time of his death, who wishes to be known as Peter, says he collected Thompson Neal from the home of another friend on the evening of 18th of October 1985. Thompson Neal had taken heroin and was near collapse. Peter says he took Thompson Neal home and put him to bed. During the night his breathing slowed down, but by morning he seemed to be peaceful. So what I researched online in regards to, drug overdoses and heroin overdoses, it does seem to fit with an overdose of heroin in that it does apparently slow down your breathing, and obviously that can become fatal. But the article does go on to say, other friends in the house found him collapsed later in the day and called an ambulance, which took him to Whipps Cross Hospital. In the early hours of the next morning, Thompson Neal inhaled his own vomit and died of aspiration pneumonia, according to the death certificate. So the fact that this young man has passed away and how it caused controversy for Dr. Simpson is explained in another part of the article, which reads, the case of Stuart Thompson Neal, who died in Whipps Cross Hospital, London, after inhaling his own vomit, caused controversy when pathologist Professor Keith Simpson refused to carry out an autopsy for fear that the victim might have AIDS.
Oh, Stuart. Only 22, so young. So did he die from heroin or HIV/AIDS?
Well, this is it. I think you and I have got the same question that the friends of Stuart had. And in the article, it goes on to say, friends of Thompson Neal are demanding a full post-mortem to establish the cause of his death. They say the first suggestion of AIDS did not come until after his death, and that the doctor who treated him did not believe he had the disease. They fear the case may provide a precedent for not carrying out a full post-mortem on other homosexuals. So we get reference to the doctor that was treating Stuart while he was in hospital. The article goes on to share that later at the inquest, that Dr. Giles Elrington, the hospital registrar who treated Thompson Neal, told the friends that he did not think he had AIDS. The disease has clear symptoms and he did not think Thompson Neal displayed them. He repeated that evidence to the coroner, Dr. Harold Price, last week. The suggestion that he did have the disease arose because he was both homosexual and a drug taker. Thompson Neal's friends stressed that although he had a history of drug taking, he was only a casual user when he died.
I'm so confused. So Stuart didn't have AIDS?
Well, we'll never know because a post-mortem was never undertaken, even though the coroner had requested that Dr. Simpson carry one out. And obviously we know that he refused. But I do kind of question, I'm not a medical expert, but it's 1983. Would there been any physical signs on the inside that Stuart had HIV/AIDS if there was none being displayed that were known at the time in 1983 on the exterior? So yeah, I think it's a bit of a tricky one, really.
And with 1983 being so early into the AIDS pandemic, this surely would set a precedent.
Yes, and Stuart's death in this article does highlight that there was a fear and a worry in the way that Stuart's body was handled, that it was going to set a precedent for other pathologists to refuse to carry out postmortems on individuals that died of AIDS or AIDS-related deaths. And, Stuart's friends, highlighted in the article when they stated they fear the case may provide a precedent for not carrying out a full post-mortem on other homosexuals. So here you've got Stuart, who, by his friends' admission in the article, is gay and is also a drugs user. So he fits both of those high-risk groups that was being pushed at the time in 1983 that, here's this new virus and these are the high-risk groups, homosexuals, gay men, and drug users. So it does seem to be as well that there is a bit of a worry that gay men are going to start being refused post-mortems because of the prejudice perhaps of the pathologist at the time. And even the registrar, Dr. Elrington of Whipps Cross Hospital, who was looking after Stuart, stated in his evidence at the inquest, and I quote, It is clearly inappropriate for a person to be refused a post-mortem simply because he has risk factors for AIDS. It has cast an unfair slur on this man.
I suppose it's reassuring to know that along with Stewart's friends, the registrar at least seemed to be disappointed with the treatment of Stewart.
Indeed, but he wasn't the only one, because despite being highly regarded, Dr. Simpson's decision not to do a post-mortem on Stewart was also scrutinised by others within the field. So the article goes on. Several last week expressed a different view from that of Professor Simpson. Professor Colin Berry, Secretary of the Association of Clinical Pathologists, said the post-mortem examination was an important investigative tool of medicine. I would be reluctant to say we should not do autopsies on AIDS cases, just like that. And then Professor Arthur Keith Mant, who succeeded Professor Simpson as the head of Department of Forensic Medicine at Guy's Hospital, London, said, "There are risks associated with all jobs. A soldier does not refuse to go into battle because he might get hurt. Whatever job one does, one should accept the risks."
That's pretty embarrassing for Simpson, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. And you know, there was another professional voice 3 days earlier on the 3rd of November 1983 in another article in the Daily Telegraph that was covering the verdict of Stewart's inquest. And the headline reads, "Coroner dispels fears over AIDS victims' bodies." And the article starts by saying, "Fears that pathologists, mortuary staff and undertakers would refuse to handle the bodies of victims of the disease AIDS were dispelled yesterday by Dr. John Burton, the Secretary of the Coroners Society of England and Wales. He said it was possible to carry out post-mortem examinations and prepare bodies of AIDS victims for burial, provided appropriate precautions were taken." And later in the article, he states these precautions would be simply treat the body like they would any other body that was known to have been suffering from, quote, other highly infectious diseases. And you know, he's right, because I saw many articles that were kind of referencing this topic or specifically Stewart's case, where they were saying before HIV/AIDS, there was hepatitis, blood and bodily fluids, post-mortem, and pathologists and mortuary staff having to deal with the deceased with hepatitis, that you would wear what we would term today the relevant PPE. And, you know, according to the University of Cambridge, other highly infectious diseases that were around in the 1960s and 70s, such as typhoid, polio, smallpox was still around. Then you've got the pneumonias, 1970s, you've got the tuberculosis. So I think what he's trying to say is that these pathologists should already have experienced handling deceased bodies that have had these other highly infectious diseases, and that HIV/AIDS is no different, really.
And did Dr. Simpson have anything to say in response?
Oh, of course. And in this Daily Telegraph article, it states, Professor Simpson defended his decision last week, quoting, "The suspicion that the patient had AIDS arose for 3 reasons. He was young, in his 20s, a homosexual, and drug addict."
You said Simpson was highly regarded? Surely, no matter how highly regarded he was, you cannot take those alleged attributes he termed suspicious and say that someone had AIDS. That makes no sense at all.
Exactly, and I think that's what makes it all very disappointing in regards to Dr. Simpson, because he was obviously very good at his job, a very good career, he was highly regarded, and I don't think you can dispute that. I just think at the time of Stewart's death and the coroner requesting Dr. Simpson to carry out a post-mortem in 1983, Dr. Simpson was 76 years old, born in 1907. So I just think with the society's attitude at the time, plus with HIV/AIDS coming onto the scene the year prior, and then immediately being dubbed the gay plague, I just can't help but think that the articles and Dr. Simpson's refusal was more down to underlying prejudice on his part. But could be completely wrong. But I think Dr. Elrington hints to it in his quote in one of the articles. Possibly he knew Dr. Simpson, maybe occasionally bumped into him at Whipps Cross Hospital, or maybe only just encountered Dr. Simpson in the event of Stewart's death, when he states it is clearly inappropriate for a person to be refused a post-mortem simply because he has high risk factors for AIDS. It has cast an unfair slur on this man. And then obviously as well, you've got Stewart's friends that were quoted in the article as saying that they fear the case may provide a precedent for not carrying out a full post-mortem on other homosexuals. So, you know, I think these might give, I know it's not a definitive answer, just perhaps just the attitudes of Dr. Simpson in regards to homosexuals and his refusal to want to carry out a post-mortem on Stuart.
That's interesting.
And in the article, Dr. Simpson goes on to say he also had a pneumonia which he seemed unable to resist, which is also a characteristic of the disease. My attitude was that AIDS is easily communicated, and until we know more about it and how to treat it, it would be wrong to expose the staff of the public mortuary to it.
Maybe he knew something we didn't, but he hasn't convinced me that he wasn't just being a dickhead.
Yeah, and I'd be inclined to agree with you, because even though he's kind of right in what he's saying, if Stuart did have a pneumonia, which he seemed unable to resist, which was also a characteristic of AIDS disease, because a lot of individuals that die of AIDS generally die of an AIDS-related illness, which generally seems to be the most common one, is a form of pneumonia. So, he could be on the right tracks there, but still, I think the professionals have already stated that he could have easily protected himself by wearing the correct and appropriate PPE that had been in place decades before for other highly infectious diseases. And I'm also aware that by 1983, they knew the routes of transmission of what was then just, AIDS and HIV. So I kind of think this is just a bit of a Dr. Simpson covering his tracks. He probably knew this at the time when he refused to carry out the post-mortem, although I'm sure he probably wasn't aware that it was going to cause such a controversy. And also as well, got the 3 experts, 4 if you include the registrar that treated Stuart, that all were from the field and the profession that all contradicted Dr. Simpson. So I think really he is just, outnumbered on this one.
So what did the inquest rule in the end?
Well, the coroner at the inquest, Dr. Price, recorded a verdict of accidental death from drug abuse on the dead man, Mr. Stuart Thompson Neal of Islington, North London. He also ruled that no other pathologist should take the risk of examining the body.
Risk? 3 respected experts stated with the correct precautions in place, Stuart's body wasn't a risk. And if they still had access to Stuart's body, why did they not do a post-mortem?
Yeah, I had the same question as well, actually. Given Stuart died in 1983, it's unclear as to what blood or bodily fluid test that they could do on Stuart to establish if he had HIV and AIDS, because the first antibody test didn't come along until 2 years later in 1985. However, had Dr. Simpson done a post-mortem, and given that he did mention in the evidence to the inquest that was mentioned in the article that Stuart was suffering a form of pneumonia, then he could have taken a sample of Stuart's lungs to establish if it was the AIDS-related pneumonia that was discovered in 1981 in America, which is called, I'm probably not going to pronounce this correctly, but it's pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, or more commonly referred to as PCP. So yeah, he could have perhaps established if it was PCP and then been able to confirm whether Stuart was HIV positive or not. But I think really ultimately we understand that the cause of death was through suffocating on his own vomit. And also as well, I think we have to go by the testimony of Dr. Elrington that stated that Stuart wasn't showing any classic signs on the exterior of his body of being somebody who was perhaps suffering from HIV and AIDS. So I think really his testimony is really kind of the only way that they could at the inquest, and I think that we can read in the articles, is that it's pretty highly likely that Stuart wasn't suffering from HIV/AIDS.
I understand the verdict, but do you think it leaves more unanswered questions than answered?
I don't know. I think, it was a stupid thing for Dr. Simpson to do, to make those claims, because I think from the articles, I think we get the picture that had he not made those claims, that the friends of Stuart and Dr. Elrington would have just put the death down to Stuart's drug use, and that would have been the end of the matter. But I think for Dr. Simpson to then come along and then state, I'm not going to do a post-mortem because he fits the high-risk category groups for HIV/AIDS, then whether the friends believed it or not, it just puts that doubt in their mind. And then for Dr. Simpson to then say, I'm not going to do a post-mortem so that I can come back to you and say, well, yes, it was, or no, it wasn't, I got it wrong. And then again for the inquest as well to say the same, the body's too high risk, which puts the doubt in the mind again, because they haven't got a definitive answer whether he has got HIV/AIDS or not, but the body's too high risk for another pathologist to come along and do a post-mortem, to be able to then say, well, actually, after all this, yes, he was, or no, he wasn't. I just think it's just rotten. It's just a rotten way to have behaved. But, ultimately, I think whether Stuart was HIV positive or not shouldn't overshadow that an incredibly young man lost his life, regardless of his lifestyle choices. And yet, without knowing it, Stuart was instrumental at the start of the AIDS pandemic in bringing together experts who agreed unanimously that people who died of AIDS or AIDS-related illness were not a greater risk post-mortem than anybody else with any other infectious disease, in ensuring that Dr. Simpson wasn't able to set a precedent.
Really?
And shortly after the inquest into Stuart's death had concluded, Stuart Thompson Neal, aged 22, was laid to rest in Manor Park Cemetery in East London on the 11th of November 1983. Stuart was the first to be placed in a common grave. And in a bid to try and find out a little bit more about Stuart and the kind of person he was, I did try to trace some of Stuart's surviving family in Colchester, Essex, and sadly I found that his father had passed away in 2016, although he is survived by a sister called Suzanne, who I was able to follow through, various public records, but sadly lost track of her around 2010.
An incredibly sad story.
And in light of Stuart's story, despite me saying that Dr. Simpson wasn't able to set a precedent, which he didn't, unfortunately, 2 years later, in 1985, the same happened again.
Oh, not again.
Sadly, yes. So this was in The Guardian on the 5th of December, 1985, and the headline reads, "Doctors accused of AIDS fear." The Westminster coroner, Dr. Paul Knapman, yesterday criticised doctors who refused to perform autopsies on 2 homosexuals because of rumours that they might have AIDS.
Just like before, rumour and speculation.
Exactly. And this article's a lot more toned down, so you haven't got the vilification of gay men and homophobia that we've seen previously, but tie that with the hysteria of HIV and AIDS and 2 gay men and, voila. Anyhow, the article continues with a quote from Dr. Knapman. "If an outbreak of mass hysteria breaks out among the medical profession, how can we expect the rest of the country to behave?" Oh, I love Dr. Knapman. Dr. Knapman was speaking at the inquest on Mr. Michael Bedford, aged 35, who was found dead at his flat in Berwick Street, Soho, London on October the 29th. The inquest heard that he was depressed over the death of his friend, Mr. John Cassidy, who died on October the 7th in the Middlesex Hospital with cancer and what doctors believed was AIDS-related tuberculosis.
That is sad. Do you think when they say friend, they're hinting they were together romantically?
I mean, at the inquest, I think they're referring to them as friends, but the article starts off by saying 2 homosexual men, and I think with whatever information the paper has gathered, and I know we shouldn't always believe what we read in the papers, but I think putting 2 and 2 together, then I think they were 2 gay men. Whether they were in a relationship together or not, I don't know. Maybe that will become a little bit clear the more that we look into this. But I think for all intent and purposes, they were 2 gay men.
Yeah.
So because of this alleged speculation that Mr. Cassidy had passed away from AIDS-related tuberculosis, the article continues. Because of this, they refused to carry out a post-mortem examination on Mr. Cassidy, and when Mr. Bedford died 3 weeks later, a pathologist, Dr. Ian West, refused to touch the body. Dr. Knapman said, "What's to stop you murdering someone by injection and putting the rumour around that he has AIDS?" Dr. West replied, "I think you would find that no forensic scientist in the country would touch it." He added that there had already been several deaths among laboratory workers handling specimens of AIDS victims. Dr. Knapman said, "It appears now that not only did Bedford not have the AIDS antibody, but neither did his friend Cassidy. Yet the pathologist would not perform the autopsy on Cassidy. I am not going to let this go. We really must have some better system than word of mouth." He adjourned the inquest until next Monday and directed that Middlesex Hospital pathologist should attend.
So what did the inquest determine in the end?
Well, apart from the clear frustration of one seriously pissed off coroner in Dr. Knapman, who I just think is absolutely fantastic. He's not willing to take any bullshit as to how these pathologists are treating the bodies of, regardless of their sexuality, they're 2 gay men, but treating these 2 men and kind of applying this suspicion that they've died of AIDS or an AIDS-related illness or have got HIV/AIDS just because they are gay. But sadly, there is absolutely no follow-up that I could find in the press archives anyway of what happened next at the inquest, because I think I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall.
But how did they know the men didn't have antibodies?
In that article that I've just read on the 5th of December, 1985, it's amazing that Dr. Knapman states, and I quote, "It appears now that not only did Bedford not have the AIDS antibody, but neither did his friend Cassidy. So to not have the antibody, it seems like an antibody test has been carried out on both of the men. And I do know from the articles that I read that the HIV/AIDS antibody test did start rolling out in 1985. This is October 1985.
That's interesting.
So that just leaves us with publicly available information for these two chaps in the form of their death certificates. So in the case of John Patrick Cassidy, he died on the 7th of October 1985 at the Middlesex Hospital, and he would have been around 38 years old. And his cause of death is listed as bronchopneumonia and tuberculosis without post-mortem. So that would probably suggest that he was in hospital for a period, whether it was long or short, but long enough for the medical team to be able to establish that he was suffering from bronchopneumonia and tuberculosis to put it down as his cause of death.
Was it common for a 38-year-old to not recover from those conditions?
Well,
especially while being treated in hospital?
Exactly. You're asking the same question that I asked myself. How is it that we have John Cassidy, a 37-year-old young man who's in a central London hospital, no doubt receiving the best care and treatment for pneumonia and tuberculosis, hasn't got a strong enough immune system to be able to fight off the infection and make a full recovery? And I can't help but wonder if this is perhaps where the pathologist who refused to carry out a post-mortem on John Cassidy applied the suspicion, and it was only a suspicion, that he had an AIDS diagnosis, because he's a young gay man, so he's in the high-risk category group that was known at the time of homosexuals. So he's a gay man, he's got a form of pneumonia. So was this the PCP, which is the age-related pneumonia that was first identified in America in 1981? And he's 37 years old and he hasn't got the immune system to be able to fight off those infections despite receiving medical intervention. So I can't help but wonder if that's where the pathologist applied this suspicion. However, we must go by what was stated at the inquest, and there seems to be some certainty when Dr. Natman said John Cassidy tested negative for HIV/AIDS antibodies.
That's what I was saying.
So looking back at the death certificate, the informant of John Cassidy's death is John's brother Thomas. His brother's come over from Northern Ireland because he's in Westminster on the same day that his brother passes away. He registers the death. But what I found slightly unusual, he hasn't been able to give an occupation. It's just a crossed line.
So this perhaps suggests John left Ireland to start a new life in London. And given the vague detail, he perhaps wasn't in regular contact with his family.
Exactly. And, even this is only a small snippet of information. It's very stereotypical. You see this time and time again where gay men come to London from other corners of the United Kingdom, whether it be Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and even the north of England. They come to London perhaps because they've been outed or ostracised by their family and friends, and perhaps, persecuted by the local community for being gay. So they come to London to be amongst other gay men where they'll feel relatively safe. And perhaps as well for economic reasons, better job, better paid job. And I'm sure the nightlife would have been a good draw as well. But I just think it's quite telling that, John Cassidy's brother, when he registered the death, the day that his brother dies, and he's obviously come over from Northern Ireland because that's what he's put as his address, he's from Northern Ireland, isn't able to state what his brother did for work. And also as well, he doesn't know where his brother's usual address in London is. So perhaps to me, it just probably highlights that there weren't much contact, if any contact there whatsoever, but perhaps John Cassidy, understanding that he was severely unwell and perhaps wasn't going to pull through, has said, you best call my family and let them know. And that's how the brothers come over from Northern Ireland to take care of his brother, essentially. And of which he fulfilled, as he'd registered the death of his brother, John Patrick Cassidy. He moved the body from London back to Northern Ireland, where John Patrick Cassidy was buried in a family grave in a Roman Catholic ceremony.
What a sad story.
And in respect of Michael John Bedford, he sadly passed away on the 29th of October 1985, so just 22 days after his friend John Patrick Cassidy, and he was found at 17C Berwick Street in Soho. His date and place of birth was 1950, born in the beautiful Bahamas, and the informant on the death certificate is Paul Nachman, that we mentioned in the article, coroner from West London, subject to an inquest held on the 9th of December 1985. And the cause of death after the inquest is listed as 1, unascertainable, with an open verdict. The cause of death, given the inquest that was held on the 9th of December 1985, and the UK Coroner's Office clarifies that an unascertainable death would be where the pathologist is unable to establish the cause of death.
It makes me wonder if Dr. Natman is only frustrated because he was initially informed it was an AIDS-related death. when releasing the body.
You know, I'd be inclined to agree with you, actually, because Dr. Natman at the inquest is feeling a little bit red-faced because he's issued a preliminary death certificate so that Michael's mother, Teresa Bedford, could lay her son to rest, which she did 10 days after Michael died on the 8th of November 1985 with a cremation at Greenwich Crematorium. And then a little under a month later, on the 4th of December 1985, Dr. Natman opens the inquest, and here's the evidence that pathologist Dr. Ian West declined to carry out a post-mortem on Michael Bedford and has only applied the suspicion that he passed away from AIDS or an AIDS-related death. So Dr. Natman does sound a little bit ticked off that he's allowed the body to be released. I'd imagine no evidence at the Berwick Street home in Soho that would indicate any form of suicide, such as empty pill bottles or any kind of exterior marks to the body or in the manner that the body was found. So an internal examination would have been vital to perhaps establish the cause of death, such as stomach contents for, any pills or drugs, toxicology tests for drugs and alcohol to see if there was an overdose of those, or just an examination of the internal organs to establish an underlying health condition, even looking at the heart to see if he'd suffered a heart attack from an underlying health condition, or perhaps, he was so grief-stricken because they talk about that he had this depression after his friend, John Patrick Cassidy, had passed away. Or did he just merely die of a broken heart? But I guess, we'll never know. And I suspect, like you say, that's why Dr. Natman sounded so ticked off. The fact that the only evidence that was reliable, which was Michael's body, had since been cremated. And I guess that's why when a coroner rules an inquest, as he did here on the 9th of December 1985, an open verdict, is because there was no means of being able to be satisfied to the cause of death.
Either way, it is an incredibly sad story for both the men and their families.
Yeah, incredibly sad. And I'd imagine with an open verdict, just like we today, there's no definitive answer as to what happened. I can't imagine it would have brought the families any peace or closure, especially the family of Michael John Bedford.
So, still in 1985, this next article comes direct from Gloucester Prison.
That's right. So the Mirror newspaper published on the 29th of November 1985 a story with the headline, "Death Threats to AIDS Prisoner," with the strapline, "Get him out, plea." And of course, anything AIDS related is deemed an exclusive. A prisoner with the deadly AIDS virus has brought terror to a jail. Cellmates of Del Sinclair are so frightened they have threatened to kill him, it was claimed yesterday. In a message smuggled from prison, they pleaded, "For God's sake, get him out of here." The note was carried by John Abbots, who was freed on Monday after 5 years in Gloucester Prison for theft. Abbots, 42 of Franklin, Birmingham, said yesterday, "The lads told me to get help because they are worried sick. They say if Sinclair goes near them, they'll kick him to death. They are that frightened. You've got no idea how it feels being locked up with someone who's got AIDS."
Please. Frightened? What a bunch of little muscle Marys because of one man and his HIV.
I know, it's like what a bunch of pussies. Especially as the article goes on to state, remand prisoner Sinclair, 33, has been in isolation in the jail's hospital wing since medical tests confirmed he was carrying the deadly virus.
Have you noticed in many of these articles they use the word carrier of HIV or carrying HIV?
Yeah, I think it was possibly just standard language at the time. I don't think it had any stigmatizing meaning. But no, I think it's just standard language for the time. And plus, Sinclair is isolated in the prison hospital wing, so I don't understand really what all the fuss is all about with the other prisoners. But anyway, let's read the rest. Abbott said a prisoner who had shared a cup of tea and a cigarette with Sinclair had also been given blood tests. Gosh. He said some prison officers were unwilling to escort Sinclair to court. Prison Governor Nicholas Wall said prisoners and staff who had expressed concern about the AIDS carrier had now been reassured.
So with everybody reassured, was that the end of the matter? What happened next to Del Sinclair?
Well, I did a search on Del in the hope of finding out what happened next. However, I found another article in the Sunday People newspaper only 4 weeks earlier on the 3rd of November 1985. This time, Del was in front of the prison wall instead of behind it, and there was a large photograph of him holding up a bowl of porridge.
Porridge? He's got to be taking the piss.
Well, in short, yes. And I have to say, for the time, he's taken the piss in style. The headline reads, "Prison grub, it's enough to make any villain go straight." So the article says, Del Sinclair, 33, and graduate of Dartmoor, Wandsworth, Reading, Maidstone, and 20 other jails throughout the UK, speaks about porridge with conviction. 47 convictions, in fact, plus 300 other offences taken into consideration since the age of 11.
Prison porridge guide. And who comes out top and bottom?
Well, Gloria, I'm glad you asked, because inset into the article is a little snippet of Del Sinclair's porridge guide. And according to Del, if you wanted to take a holiday at Her Majesty's pleasure back in 1985, then the best place to get your prison grub was at Pentonville Prison, which is just round the corner from me, actually. He gave them 2 arrows of shame, and he put a little side note that said they even managed to ruin fish and chips in this jail, but the bread pud's all right. So that's good to know. Del's recommendation is a bread pud if you end up in Pentonville. But in stark contrast, he gave Wandsworth Prison 4 arrows of shame for the worst prison grub of all. Eating there is part of the punishment. I should hope so, and all, Del. Anyway, moving on.
Oh, so Del's a bit of a bad boy. I like bad boys.
Just a bit. Our Del boy's definitely a bad boy, but something's telling me that prison isn't doing anything for old Del boy. But, you know, there's hope, as the article goes on to state. Now, going straight with the threat of a 9-year suspended if he steps out of line, Del plans to cash in on all those years of holding pudding out for treacle. What Egon Roney did for the Motorway Cafe, Sinclair D, number K3244, will do as a gastronomic watchdog for HM prisons. He is writing The Good, Prison Food Guide, which will lift the lid off porridge and expose horrors of the cardboard sausage.
He sounds like a right character. So how did he end up back in prison only 4 weeks later?
Well, in the original article with the Daily Mirror, Del says he's on remand, which is defined on the UK government website as being charged with a crime and being held in prison until your trial. Reasons could be because he has a criminal past, has breached his bail in the past, or the court believes he is unlikely to return to court for the hearing. And while Del's first newspaper appearance is a little bit tongue-in-cheek and a bit of a cheeky chappy, I'm not in any way playing down or condoning criminal behaviour, but it must have been a blow in 1985 to be placed back on remand and then test positive for HIV/AIDS, which in 1985 was a guaranteed death sentence. There is another article that follows that might shed light on why he was back on remand, albeit the article focuses on his AIDS diagnosis.
This is the Daily Mirror, published on the 3rd of December, 1985.
That's right. The headline reads, JP's, Justice of Peace, JP's jail AIDS burglar. So it looks like he was on remand for burglary. And the article reads as follows. Yesterday, after admitting burglary charges, Sinclair told the court at Hereford that after his condition was discovered, he was locked in a cell alone 24 hours each day. He added, "If you send me to prison, I will be put in solitary because other prisoners will be frightened of catching AIDS from me."
It's a hard one, really. Because while he does protest about how he'll be treated in prison, and by his own admission, he has an extensive criminal past, not to mention back in prison this time for burglary, and learning he has AIDS, you can't help but feel for him.
Yeah, I'm the same. And, you know, obviously nobody can condone crime, and I'm sure there is a list of victims as long as his arm. But does the ignorance, fear and rhetoric of the AIDS in 1985 warrant threats of violence and death by other prison inmates, along with 24-hour isolation, which sounds like it was more for his own protection rather than the protection of the other inmates claiming to be scared of his AIDS diagnosis.
And as we know, and he must have known then in 1985, his prison sentence was really a death sentence because there was no treatment, no cure.
Yeah, and I kind of wonder what kind of outlook is that going to give him? You know, is it going to give him any incentive to perhaps now want to turn his life around and ensure that, you know, he goes straight and essentially enjoys whatever life he's got left, perhaps with just a glimmer of hope that one day there will be a treatment, there will be a cure? Or is he just going to fall into self-stigma and perhaps I deserve this and you're just not gonna change him whatsoever? So the article concludes, the magistrate sentenced Sinclair to 1 year's jail. Last week his solicitor told the court that although he was carrying the AIDS virus, he was not actually suffering from the deadly disease. But I don't understand what the solicitor's position is here. He's admitted to the burglaries, and obviously he's got to serve time for that. I'm not saying that. But, you know, even in this case, I think you can probably tell either Del's got genuine concern about his HIV/AIDS status, or he's milking it a little bit to try and get a little bit of leniency. And I to be honest with you, even though it's wrong, I can't fault the guy. If you can get some time knocked off your sentence by milking it, then why not? But yeah, I just can't work out what the solicitor's sticking his nose in for. But there you go. That's how that ended.
So he'd have most likely served 6 months.
Yeah, probably, because I think that's how prison sentences work in the UK. That generally, if there's good behaviour, they only serve half the time. So he got a year. So yeah, he'd probably just served 6 months.
And do you happen to know what happened to Del Boy after his sentence?
Well, I'm not sure if his prison record would be something that I could be privy to understand if he continued to flitter in and out of prison after serving this sentence. There is certainly nothing further in the press archive. So, in order to find out what happened next to Del Sinclair, we had to turn to publicly available information, again in the form of a death certificate. So they say life begins at 40, but sadly not for Del Sinclair, because on the 1st of August 1993, he passed away in King's College Hospital, London. It'll come as no surprise that the cause of death was the AIDS-related pneumonia we mentioned earlier, the PCP, and they also mentioned immunodeficiency. He was registered as Del Sinclair, formerly known as Derek Townsend, so at some point in his life he'd obviously changed his name, which probably gives an indication to the character of the man. He was born in 1952 in Chelmsford, Essex, and the death was registered by his brother Robert. The occupation was given as night security at time of death, and he was also living in a flat in Hurst Street Estate in Herne Hill, South East London. So it might give an indication that at some point in Del's life, when it was, we can't be sure, but he'd come out, got himself a job, got himself a pad, and had essentially gone on the straight and narrow.
At least it seems that Del had turned his life around and gone straight by the time of his death. And you mentioned Del had a brother.
That's right, his older brother Robert, who I managed to track down and extended an invitation to perhaps share a little bit more about Del and his life, but sadly he declined.
Well, that's a shame. But I guess for some, the past is the past, and we must always respect that. One last thing. Is there a book titled The Good Prison Guide by Del Sinclair?
Well, that's a really good question, actually. So what I propose is, let's close our eyes, and everybody listening, close your eyes, and we're going to go back to the year 1990, and we're going to have Del tell us in his own words.
Pentonville, the Dossers Jail. Short-term specialising in an amusing bread pudding, bacon and egg pie, and fried fish that was not so much frozen as fossilised. How can anyone louse up fish and chips? I rate it 2 arrows. It's saved by the bread pud, which overnight has wolfed down with mugs of steaming tea. Then there's Gloucester Prison. How's this for starters? Monday to Friday, the porridge is grade 1 pig meal. Bacon shatters if dropped on the floor, and tea is 5 parts diesel. I rate this place 3 arrows, and a hacksaw, if there's one spare. As for Wandsworth, Nick, this place was the pits. Eating there is part of the punishment. The liver is as tough as leather, the stew is all gristle and bone, and I swear pies are made by a guy called Todd from the Sweeney. Dartmoor. Here it's the meat pies that stick in your throat. I've never been convicted for violence, just a burglar and a bit of thieving, but I often thought about strangling the cook. That was 1985. I never did get around to writing that book, The Good Prison Food Guide by me, Del Sinclair. Something came up.
All of the actual newspaper articles mentioned in this serving are available on the Extra Tea blog. You can find the link below in the show notes. If you've enjoyed listening to two bitter old queens, then don't be a shady bitch and show us some love with
a big fat like,
a comment,
a share, as in the link, not as in do you believe in life after love? Oh.
And for fuck's sake, don't forget to
subscribe and follow.